The auction room is about 1/4 of the size that it was before COVID because we've had to convert it into what is effectively a TV studio. And now very few people come to the sales. The banks are filled with bidders, and the room is generally filled with lights and TV cameras instead. This, however, is a bit more traditional. And I'd like to welcome you all formally. I'm Mark Porter. I'm the chairman of Christie's in the Americas and a proud trustee of the New York Botanical Garden. And for several years now, we've hosted the Andrew Carnegie Distinguished Lecture, where we hear from luminaries from around the world of plants, landscape, and all the things that we're interested in. Tonight, we'll be learning about the future of urban green spaces. This is a subject which is of longstanding interest to many of us, but also a very timely one as we make our communities more resilient in the face of climate change and other disruptions. It's my honor to introduce Jennifer Bernstein, who I hope most of you have gotten to know, the Garden's Chief Executive Officer and William C. Steer Senior President. Steer Senior President. Jennifer came to us from the Natural Resources Defense Council, where she served as Chief Development Officer and Interim Chief Operating Officer. We're delighted to have her here at the Garden. And so, welcome all, and without further delay, Jennifer Bernstein.
Thank you, Mark, and thanks to you and to Christie's for hosting us in this fabulous space year after year. Good evening. I am Jennifer Bernstein, the CEO, and William C. Steer, Senior President of the New York Botanical Garden, and it is such a pleasure to welcome all of you, our patrons, trustees, and friends, to tonight's distinguished lecture, the Andrew Carnegie Distinguished Lecture. I'd like to acknowledge the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their very dedicated support of the Andrew Carnegie Distinguished Lecture. And as this is the first time that we're gathering since the passing of the corporation's legendary president, Martin Gregorian, it is only fitting that we take a moment to remember him and his enormous contributions to the cultural and intellectual life of our city and beyond. I'd like to thank our trustees, patrons, and friends for your support of the garden, particularly over these past 2 challenging years. Tonight, we are delighted to host architectural historian and author Victoria Newhouse. Victoria has written and lectured extensively on museums and architecture, but she's with us tonight to talk about her latest book, Parks of the 21st Century, Reinvented Landscapes, Reclaimed Territories, which she's co-authored with Alex Pisha, Senior Landscape Architect at Sawyer Burson. Alex is with us here tonight as well. Victoria and Alex say that we are in the midst of a golden age of park creation, and in this book, they present nearly 50 recently created parks that have been turned from factories, abandoned railroads, and industrial waterfronts into thriving, beneficial landscapes. Around the world, and most dramatically in China, this new wave of parks is adapting to the changes in our environment, infrastructure, culture, and politics. Landscape architects have been referred to as the first environmentalists, and Victoria's beautiful book makes a strong case that landscape, even maybe more so than architecture, is what makes our cities more livable. Architectural record called Parks of the 21st Century, just the tonic we need to remind ourselves of the power of renewing and reclaiming public spaces, so we can all look forward to a most refreshing experience. After Victoria's talk, I'll join her back on stage with her co-author, Alex Pisha, for a conversation and to take some questions from all of you. And afterwards, Victoria and Alex will be available for book signings. Now, please join me in giving a warm garden welcome to Victoria Newhouse.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, Jennifer. I've talked about the book on a few occasions since it was published last September, but this is the first time that I have talked to a committed group of garden fans. So that is a great pleasure for me. In the winter of 2016, Alex Pisha, a landscape designer who is here with me tonight, and I embarked on an adventure that lasted 5 years and took us to more than 52 public parks in 9 countries. The objective of our adventure was to examine recent parks built on post-industrial and disturbed sites. As Jennifer mentioned, Adrian Benepe of the Brooklyn Botanic Garden and formerly of the Bloomberg administration calls the first 2 decades of the 21st century a golden age of park construction. And Alex and I agreed that they deserved a book-length examination. But why are there now so many new parks? Why is this era experiencing a frenzy of park building around the world? 3 factors answer the question. First of all, the environmental movement, spearheaded by Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, and Ian McHarg's Design with Nature, assumed growing importance. The public became increasingly aware of climate change thanks to the growing frequency and ferocity of floods, wildfires, and droughts. Second, changes wrought by the conversion from the industrial era to the service society were becoming increasingly apparent. The end of the industrial age made obsolete millions of factories, together with associated storage, moving, and shipping facilities. Here you see the Los Angeles Industrial Bay. Once beautiful natural shorelines and major urban sites were left polluted and inaccessible. Think of the appalling state in which the wharves of Boston and New York City were left when they were abandoned in the middle of the 20th century. Or of the country's Rust Belt, or of Germany's Ruhr Valley. Third, public space began to erode, beginning with mid-20th century suburbanization and later 20th century commercial initiatives such as malls. Malls may appear public, but in reality, they are policed to bolster private property and personal security. The phenomena is so expansive that Beatrice Colomina of Princeton University hails social media as the new public space. The 2020 pandemic brought renewed attention to the value of parks and green spaces. They were the saving grace for many in urban areas, offering much needed air and exercises. These 3 factors have inspired the rehabilitation of forgotten and damaged sites as parks, the subject of our books, Parks of the 21st Century. The trend toward remediating brownfield sites paralleled the movement to reuse abandoned architecture. Those of us who live in New York City remember the massive conversion of empty loft buildings in Soho by artists in the 1970s. Of the world's innumerable abandoned sites, railways are among the most plentiful. And among the many railways that have been transformed into parks, the High Line is the best known. That obsolete railroad, converted into a park by James Corner Field Operations with the architects Diller Scofidio and Renfro, opened to the public in 2009. By 2015, 60 railroad projects inspired by the High Line were being considered around the globe. And by 2019, the High Line itself, by then expanded to 1.45 miles, was receiving 8 million visitors a year, more than the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which gets 7.4 million, the Museum of Modern Art, 3 million, and the Statue of Liberty, 4.3 million. This repurposed rail line sends a strong signal of the current interest in landscape. As I speak to you, the same architects, Diller, Scofidio, and Renfro, are working with Peter Walker and a firm of Italian designers to convert elevated rail tracks and adjacent territory in southeast Milan into a raised greenway, meadows, and woodlands. The Parco Romano, here you see a plan for it and two of the drawings imagining what it will look like, together with a mixed-use residential area, is to be completed in time for the 2026 Winter Olympics. Restoring ground contaminated by industry is difficult and expensive. However, park building bestows considerable benefits, providing pleasure to people of diverse backgrounds and ages, linking areas that have been isolated, removing carbon dioxide from the air, and offering water management and land reclamation that can save billions of dollars of flood damage, not to mention human lives. In addition, there is a tremendous financial incentive to create new, green spaces. Already in 1850, the celebrated American landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted promoted the soaring land values that resulted from Birkenhead Park in Great Britain, which was designed by Joseph Paxton 5 years earlier. For Olmsted, the increased prices proved that public land could pay for itself when built in conjunction with private development. Indeed, in the 5 years after Olmsted and Calvert Vaux's Central Park opened, nearby properties appreciated tenfold. More recently, the High Line attracted $2 billion in new investments. Unfortunately, the spike in land values displaced many longtime residents. More parks have been built on waterfronts than in any other type of location, in part because of the beauty of the settings and the attraction of water activities. In New York and Shanghai, riverside park systems run for miles and rehabilitate key parts of the cities. Two of the most stunning new parks in the United States were completed on the east side of New York's East River in 2018. Hunters Point South, 11 acres, designed by SWA Balsley and Weiss Manfredi in Long Island City. And Brooklyn Bridge Park, 85 acres, designed by Michael van Valkenburg Associates, south of the Brooklyn Bridge. Sorry, this is, this is again Hunters Point South, showing the marshland, the restored marshland. Here's Brooklyn Bridge Park and another part of it. Both parks are parts of Mayor Bloomberg's Vision 2020, a framework for the city's 520 miles of shoreline, and both address water management and flood control. At Hunters Point, the designers recreated the kind of marshland native to the area to catch the river's tides, and with the help of a large elliptical lawn and turf playing field, return floodwaters to the river. Brooklyn Bridge Park's a salt marsh, its salt marsh fulfills a similar function. Both strategies handled Hurricane Sandy's storm surges successfully. On the other side of the waterway in Manhattan is Ken Smith's workshop and shop architect's 2-mile-long East River Esplanade, which is built partly under the FDR Drive and partly on piers. A sliver of the shoreline at one of these piers has been made into mussel, yes, that's the mollusk, habitat created with the help of a tidal estuary. To the south is Governor's Island, a 172-acre former naval base. Part of the island was made into a park in 2016 by the Dutch landscape architect Adrian Gers of West 8. A recent park in Detroit, Michigan, exemplifies the similar aspirations and methodologies of park development in the Western Hemisphere. The DeQuindra Cut in Detroit is an ongoing project that symbolizes how one of the nation's poorest cities resorted to landscape as a strategy for financial improvement. Planning for the cut, a former railway at and below grade, began in 2003, roughly the same time as planning began for the High Line. In New York, it was truck transport that rendered the New York City Central spur obsolete. In Detroit, it was instead the failure of the automotive industry and the city's waning population. By 2010, it was estimated that 24 square miles of the city were vacant, due largely to wholesale removal of deteriorated structures. The design for the Detroit project developed by Smith Group has more grassroots and ecological ambitions than the $250 million high-profile New York park. Dense natural vegetation and trees line either side of the 20-foot wide asphalt path that has replaced the rail lines. The first phase of the economic and sustainable design for the Greenway, which is 1.8 miles long, is intended to function without irrigation and features a native planting palette of drought-resistant plants. Security concerns about the area below street level required clear and open visibility. Thus, neatly tended grass lawns maintain sight lines for continuous open borders along the entire length of the pathway. Staggered clusters of canopy trees provide dappled shade without compromising safety, creating a unifying identity for disparate neighborhoods. The redeveloped pathways and landscapes of the DeQuindra Cut provide much needed green space and connectivity for underserved communities, acting not only as a thoroughfare, but as an outdoor gallery for the display of urban art. As with most redevelopment initiatives, the DeQuindra Cut and city officials shepherding the project remain mindful of the project's effects on the surrounding neighborhoods. The ongoing challenge is to remain committed to the original constituency, avoiding gentrification and displacing of residents. The Detroit Greenway relates to a well-known American precedent. The Emerald Necklace is a chain of connected green spaces in Boston and Brookline designed by Frederick Law Olmsted. The Detroit Loop, like ventures in Atlanta, Boston, Louisville, Portland, and elsewhere, is one of a number of 21st century linked parks in the United States running through or around urban centers, many of which accommodate tidal fluctuations, are now commonplace worldwide. Urban greenways are planned for every major city in China to advance ecological conservation and control urban sprawl. Two important differences characterize green spaces in different parts of the world: process and design. In the United States, for instance, community members play an essential role in creating a park. In China and some European countries, the community has little or no voice. Park design and ecological goals also vary radically between parks which offer typical program elements and horticultural displays to those with less programming and a focus on naturalistic, self-propagating, dynamic landscapes. One of the most stunning of the latter is the 280-acre Parc du Peuple de l'Herbe, designed by Agence Terre on the outskirts of Paris in a town called Carrière-sous-Poissy. A commuter railroad connects the low-income, socially diverse, and relatively young community with Paris. The new park opened in 2016. The Peuple de l'Herbe, or grass people, after which the park is named, are in fact insects. These insect species, together with other animal species, are protected, and an 8,000 square foot visitor center provides information about insects and the global decline of insects due to climate change and other human actions, which the New York Times has called the insect apocalypse. Like all the parks in our book, this one occupies a reclaimed area whose former uses had long been abandoned. In this case, an asparagus farm, a limestone quarry, and most recently, a landfill. The site occupies an alluvial plain adjacent to the Seine, and one of its major attractions is the views created by the designer's expansion of the river, which are worthy of a Poussin painting. The green area runs from the busy residential development at the north, with its clamorous human activities, to terrain that changes from dry to wet, where the focus is on the insect and wildlife population. Smaller ponds culminate at the river, whose embankment was made gentler with the reuse of over 55,000 cubic yards of soil excavated from the water's banks. Riprap, which you see here, protects the embankment from soil erosion. Veronique Rondeau, who manages the park and the visitor center, admits that in summer, the lack of shade and abundance of mosquitoes are problematic. Nevertheless, 20,000 people attended the opening of the park, which cost only $11.5 million to build and a relatively modest $345,000 to maintain annually. A successional forest band near the river allows for a constantly evolving landscape. This is completely different from a strictly regulated park, such as New York's High Line. However, all of the parks we included, no matter how natural looking, are design spaces that are highly engineered to reclaim land, manage water, and support plant and animal species in particular ways. Like the Carrière Park, the Alter Flugplatz, opened in 2004 on the outskirts of Frankfurt, Germany, is also successional, replacing a 19-acre airport built in the early 1950s by the US Army. It too rewilds rather than imposes a design on the site. GTL, the landscape architects, reinterpreted the city's call for a forest. Instead of designing what would have been an artificial forest, GTL opted for renaturation, a minimum intervention into environment and landscape that would support relatively natural species growth. In order to avoid the costly and time-consuming task of removing the airport's expanse of concrete and asphalt, the designers simply broke the runways into shards of different sizes, exposing soil that captures airborne seeds. A meadow filled with reeds, goldenrod, and an occasional aspen leads toward the western end of this linear green space, where a narrow parting in a thicket of white birches beckons. These trees didn't exist when the park was completed. Now, a decade later, They boast rich canopies that open overhead like the roof of a cathedral. Surprise and discovery are important components of a successful park, and desire paths, the name for paths created by visitors, lead to many such experiences, among them new trails, ponds, and various assemblages of different sized concrete blocks. Some large chunks, like those on the screen, have been compared to the ice flows painted by the famous 19th century German artist Caspar David Friedrich. Here too, we see nature's takeover of the man-made world. One of the designers remarked to us that changes in the ruderal vegetation, meaning vegetation on disturbed ground, bring about changes in the way people use the park, which enjoys 100,000 visitors annually. People of all ages find new games to play here, from adults occupied with cards and chess to children intent on active pastimes of their own devising. Another airport park, the Tempelhofer Feld in Berlin, takes a different approach, freezing the site at a particular point in time. This was the Caspar David Friedrich, and here is the Tempelhofer. It is also far larger than the Alter Flugplatz, 750 acres instead of 19 acres, and far better known. Indeed, it was one of the most famous airports in the world. Constructed by the Nazi regime from 1936 to 1941 in the shape of the imperial eagle, Tempelhof incorporated elegant light brown brick buildings that were not only a model of Art Deco architecture, but also for some time among the largest buildings in the world. The airfield became the object of worldwide attention in 1948 when it hosted the Berlin Airlift, which allowed the Allies to fly food, medicine, and other supplies into Berlin for almost a year, thus overcoming the Soviets' blockade of rail and road access. That episode, in addition to the attractiveness and functionality of the buildings, has made the airfield a much beloved landmark, and widespread protests greeted the city's decision to close it down in 2008, when the runways were deemed too short for modern aircraft. In 2010, when the area was open to the public, virtually untouched, 230,000 visitors showed up in 2 days. As a result, the city's Senate Department for Urban Development organized an international competition to choose a landscape architect to reimagine the space. From the 78 entries submitted, in May 2011, the Scottish firm Gross Max was declared the winner. Oops, sorry. This is their plan. The firm prepared a plan in consultation with the competition jury, members of the government, and local citizens. Even so, in 2014, 100% Tempelhof group formed and aggressively opposed the project. These Berliners argued that the design's inclusion of medium-scale housing at the periphery of the airport would inevitably result in an uncontrollable invasion of the green space. 100% Tempelhof was quickly joined by larger and more virulent protesters, leading to a referendum in 2014 that killed the project. This decision ruled out any kind of design. More important, it excluded pragmatic environmental improvements envisioned by Gross Max, like a lake that would have retained millions of gallons of rainwater that currently flow into canals. And as if this were not enough of what has been called an exercise in negation, that same year, Berlin's left-wing government passed a law forbidding any kind of development on the site. This means that even existing amenities, such as toilets and barbecues, have to be temporary. A local citizens group oversees the park's $3.38 million annual maintenance and security, zealously guarding against any outside interest. To us, Tempelhofer Feld appeared desolate and anonymous compared with the rich natural landscapes of Alter Flugplatz and other naturalistic parks on reclaimed land. But this is what Berliners wanted. Every year, Tempelhofer Feld receives at least 400 requests for special events and 2 million visitors. Nothing could better illustrate the contrast between these wild green spaces and those that are strictly controlled than two parks in hyper-regulated Switzerland. 8 minutes by car from the center of Zurich is a new neighborhood on land that was once occupied entirely by tanks and munition factories. In 1992, after the factories were closed, a master plan was drawn up for what has become an area of residential and service buildings. 3 of the 4 parks that were designated for the project were programmed for typical outdoor activities. Because of this, Radishel partner, who won the right to build the 4th park, was able to design something more adventurous. The limited area was hemmed in by old and new office buildings. So Radishel, in collaboration with Burkhardt Architects, devised a vertical park with a steel skeleton. To prepare the site for planting, polluted soil to a depth of over 25 feet had to be excavated, cleaned, and replaced. 104 species of climbing vines, which include clematis, climbing roses, ivy honeysuckle, hops, Virginia creeper, and silver lace, were then planted in the ground and on higher levels in irrigated troughs. The vines grow on steel tension cables. If a plant dies, it is replaced with the same species. Should the substitute not survive, it is removed and neighboring climbers expand into the vacant space. The architects inserted metal stairways, walkways, and balconies throughout the structure's 4 levels. Platforms of metal and spruce seem to slide out from the framework. A roof terrace provides views down into the structure's layers and out to the city. Our climb through the armature was an acoustic and aromatic, as well as a visual experience. Birds flew in and out of the foliage, chirping amid an enchanting play of light, shadow, and wafting scents. When Alex and I visited the park on a clear morning in July, mothers with strollers and young children, as well as small groups of teenagers, were gathering in the atrium around the park's focal point, a fountain sitting on a bed of recycled dark blue crushed safety glass. At noon, the park was inundated by people emerging from the surrounding office buildings carrying their lunch. That evening, we saw that it was also popular for picnicking families. In the daytime, the open space hosts numerous popular community activities, but in the nighttime calm, its rare visitors evoke the mysterious spindly columns of Giacometti's surrealist sculpture, The Palace at 4 a.m. Approximately an hour's train ride from Zurich brought Alex and me to the city of Basel in the tri-national region of Switzerland, France, and Germany. The city has been a center of economic and cultural activity since the mid-17th century. But beginning in the 1970s, Basel has been internationally famous for its yearly art fair. This is the location of the second Swiss park we included. Beside the Rhine River, in the northwest corner of the metropolis, is an industrial zone that has been gradually taken over by Novartis, one of the world's largest pharmaceutical companies. The 51 acre Novartis grounds are today occupied by high-profile architecture and landscape, all open to the public by reservation and enhanced by an extensive collection of artworks. In 2002, a major renovation of the campus began with the idea of transforming it into an enclave for innovation, knowledge, and encounters. To accomplish this, Novartis commissioned the well-known Italian architect and planner, Vittorio Magnano Lampignani. He designed a pedestrian city based on gridded streets and mid-rise buildings with strict rules regarding architecture and planning. Only fastigiate hornbeam were allowed on east-west streets, and trees were banned altogether from north-south thoroughfares, with the exception of the main street, Fabrikstrasse. There, 2 rows of tulip trees grace the exterior of arcades that contain cafes, shops, and outdoor seating. Accompanied by Dorothée Ambert, the landscape architect, and her husband, the architect Andrew Cruz, Alex and I began our visit to this peaceful refuge at its main gathering space known as the Forum, where a bosque of 35 pin oaks offers shade. On our way to the square, a plaza designed by Ambert and Cruz, we passed several beautiful parks. Among them, the Forum 1 courtyard with its plantings of Himalayan birch and reflecting pool, and the Physic Garden, a nod to the medicinal plantings of medieval monasteries. The square, situated on the roof of an underground bicycle garage, is one of the most recently completed elements in Novartis's landscape. It is divided into 2 green areas. To the north are a quincux, a grove of London plane trees, trained into roof forms, linden and flowering cherries, partly surrounding Cruz's glazed rectangular pavilion. To the south are clumps of yews and circular garden rooms of tall, clipped hornbeam. Ambert attributes her inspiration for the latter to the geometric gardens designed by the Danish garden architect Carl Theodor Sorensen in the 1950s. The circular rooms provide a sense of protection and privacy, which have proved ideal for informal meetings. You are perhaps all weighing which of the 2 approaches, natural or formal, you prefer. So you might find interesting the fact that even the orderly Swiss felt the need for some relief on the rarefied campus. A 15.5-acre open space modeled on the local natural landscape and intended to contrast with the manicured campus greens is devoted to uncontrolled growth and decay. I'm happy that our hosts have given me a reason to talk about the intersection between the tradition of botanical garden and the much more recent practice of rehabilitating damaged land into parks. The 2 concepts have given rise to some remarkable parks. As many of you know, the Botanic Garden is generally credited with originating during the Renaissance. Gardens founded in Pisa in 1543 and Padua in 1545 are considered 2 of the earliest examples of gardens where plants were grown and categorized for scientific, research, and educational purposes. However, these and other botanic gardens were informed by earlier gardens, and in particular, herbal manuscripts from antiquity, such as the De Matera Medica by the 1st century Roman physician Dioscorides. Early botanic garden designs embodied the biblical concept of the paradise garden as an enclosed, geometrically ordered, quadripartite space with 4 dividing paths, a reference from Genesis. Each quadrant represented one of the 4 known continents and was planted with the flora of that part of the world. If previously unknown, plants were named, then organized into rectangular beds called order beds. These did just what their names implied, imposed order on the chaos of unnamed nature. Because of their comprehensive character, botanical gardens symbolized the recovery of knowledge by man and his power over nature, among the gifts lost when Adam and Eve were ejected from the Garden of Eden. Colonization in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, primarily by Western European countries, expanded the scope of plant collections, and botanical gardens became symbols of imperial power and scientific discovery. The 19th century also saw the growth of the public parks movement. Botanic gardens were informed by this movement and began to be arranged in a picturesque manner, while parks, influenced by botanic gardens, began to be planted with exotic specimen trees and flowering display beds. In Manhattan, an early public botanic garden, the Elgin Gardens, was founded in 1801 by Dr. David Hosack, a faculty member of Columbia College and one of the first Americans to be elected to the Royal Horticultural Society of England. When he announced the opening of Elgin Gardens, Hosack claimed great social importance for his work. To quote him, "We have every reason to expect that the establishment of a botanic garden will, in a short time, meet with the general design of protecting useful knowledge and those arts which are most essentially connected with human happiness." Located on 20 acres at Fifth Avenue and 47th Street, now the site of Rockefeller Center, the gardens were celebrated for their scientific endeavors as well as for their beautifully landscaped grounds. Alex and I included 3 relatively new botanical gardens in our book, one from 2007 in Bordeaux, France, and 2 from 2010, one in Mexico City and one in Shanghai. All 3 reclaimed sites previously occupied by other activities. I have visited Bordeaux on numerous occasions since the 1970s, but I was completely unprepared for the way the city has reinvented itself since the beginning of the millennium. Among the many new initiatives called for in Dominique Perrault's plan for the city is a new botanical garden by the firm of Catherine Mosbach, with buildings by Françoise Hélène Jourdain. The brief, prepared by Philippe Richard, director of an existing botanical garden in the city center, designated a facility for the study of natural resource management and biodiversity based on a new way to display plants. Working with the botanist Patrick Blanc, Mosbach proposed demonstrating the relationship between people and plants through food, industry, pharmaceutical, and other human activities. For her, plants and people are equals. She says, "We are animals like other animals." This meant shunning an arrangement of plants according to Linnean classification, avoiding the traditional nature of plantings in botanical gardens. Instead, vegetation representative of the surrounding Aquitaine Basin is organized in 3 areas according to regional growing conditions. In the Champ de Culture, culture fields, 49 metal planting beds, each accompanied by a rainwater basin for irrigation, present vegetation in vitrine-like displays. In the Galerie des Milieux, Gallery of Backgrounds, 11 tall cliff-like earthworks show the locality's natural substrate and soil profile. And in the Jardin Aquatique, a steel walkway meanders through a water garden containing aquatic plants. A timber and glass greenhouse with a roof that incorporates solar panels hosts plants from a dry desert climate and a humid tropical one. The Bordeaux Botanical Garden is free of charge. Multiple entrances and informal circulation patterns create the feeling of a neighborhood park for its 500,000 annual visitors. It is difficult to talk about gardens in Mexico without acknowledging their rich history in that country. Among the many gardens created by Aztec rulers are, for example, Texcotzingo, about 20 miles northeast of Mexico City, and Montezuma's Huastepec Gardens. Not much is known about them in comparison to European gardens, but they are the subject of much scholarly research. They are thought to predate by at least 100 years, even the mid-15th century botanical gardens of Pisa and Padua. The new 136-acre Park Bicentenario in Mexico City was created by the federal government to honor the 200th anniversary of Mexican independence. The Grupo de Diseño Urbano, led by Mario Shetland, won the competition to design it. Located in the northwestern part of the city, in a former industrial area, the park tries to make plants and plant life more easily understandable to the public. 60% of the world's plant species live in Mexico, and the Parque Bicentenario was intended to contrast with the large research botanical garden at the National Autonomous University, also in Mexico City, dating from 1959. One of the issues GDU had to contend with was a 16-inch thick concrete slab that had capped industrial contamination. Too expensive to remove, the slab was covered with stone and soil. The depth and soil composition respond to the needs of each plant species, creating a subtly irregular topography. GDU divided the park into 5 areas with themes such as nature, wind, and sun. In the nature portion are 8 Mexican biomes, 3 in greenhouses, 5 outdoors. Each greenhouse contains an elevated metal walkway from which to observe a tropical evergreen forest, which is on the screen at the moment, a mesophyll mountain forest, and a desert. There is also an orchidarium that displays dozens of orchid species on shelves, metal grids, and in hanging cages, punctuated by enlarged photographs of the flowers. This growing area is located in a former waste tank that has been roofed over. Like the other greenhouses, it enjoys suspended footpaths. One of the most fascinating displays is the replica of chinampas, artificial islands in central Mexico that were part of an agricultural system dating to the 9th century. The chimpas in the botanical garden have beds of vegetables and flowers, including poinsettias. As for the originals, the chinampas and their irrigation system, built by the Aztecs in the 14th century, was largely replaced by the Spanish colonizers in the early 16th century. They introduced typical European street plans for which they cleared forests and created conditions prone both to floods and to water shortages. Additionally, since the early 1900s, excessive water pumping has made the water table of the Mexico City aquifer decline by more than 3 feet a year, causing the land to sink dramatically. One way Shetland has addressed water control is by topping roofs with inverted pyramids, which you see to the left of this slide. These roofs funnel water into retention tanks and then into the aquifer. Solar panels supply most of the required energy. 2 million people visit the park annually. The 319 million botanical garden in Shanghai was built by the German firm Valencian and Valencian for the 2010 World Exposition in a suburban, industrial, and agricultural area well outside the city. Using public transportation, it is more than 2 hours from Shanghai. The 500-acre site is twice the size of the New York Botanical Garden, and its lawns, specimen trees, annuals, and perennials are more a horticultural display than a botanical garden. In contrast with the rather artificial-looking garden are the experiments being undertaken back of house. Hidden from the public by planted buffers and vegetated berms are a series of concrete canals in which canaflowers and other plant species are being tested for their ability to purify water. I imagine there is further experimentation in the modern greenhouses, which we unfortunately did not visit. By far the most interesting component of the botanical garden is the open public space that has replaced a decommissioned stone quarry. Paths winding around an artificial lake lead to an inclined tunnel of weathered steel and stairs that descend into the 100-foot deep quarry pit. Another set of stairs wraps around the sheer cliff face, allowing contact with its colors and textures, as well as with the delicate plants that have rooted in its fissures. A floating walkway winds above the water's surface. Altogether, the components of the Shanghai garden, water, mountain, sequence, and metaphor, relate to aspects of traditional Chinese landscape painting, and the quarry garden evokes the mythological concept in China of a grotto heaven that harbors knowledge and freedom, which invite the curious to explore. Hopefully, travel conditions in the near future will allow us to see this dramatic park. Alex and I visited parks around the world in countries that are vastly different culturally and politically. Yet a common feature was that parks are spaces for everyone, and they are symbols of unity. If unjustified military action and land grabs represent the worst of humanity, perhaps these parks offer an alternative. Thank you.
So that was terrific. And those images, the lecture was incredible, of course, Victoria, and the images were a feast for the eyes. So thank you for that. And what an incredibly ambitious journey the two of you have been on, visiting more than 50 plus parks, which are featured in the book over the course of, did you say 6 years?
Roughly, yeah.
Yes. So, maybe to get us started, and of course, we will create an opportunity for folks in the audience to ask questions. I'm sure you all have questions that are of interest to you, but to get us going, I'll ask the first question. Victoria, and this is a two-parter, Victoria, as an architectural historian, what made you decide to write about the discipline of landscape architecture? And Alex, as a landscape architect, can you talk about one park in particular that resonated with you through this process?
Sure. I think I want to thank you to our hosts and also to all of you for coming out to this. It's wonderful to see everyone. One of the parks I think that we both enjoyed the most is in Changchun, China, a former automotive city. And I think what we liked about it is it was one of the few parks in China we saw where the government was able to actually retain all of the infrastructure, all of the sort of remnants of this industrial history. And the site has a really fascinating history in that it was a water treatment facility built by the Japanese during their occupation of China and bringing that technology in. And it was only decommissioned in 2015. So the landscape architects were able to retain all of that sort of architecture, the 1920s sort of Japanese architecture, the sediment tanks, all of this, and repurpose them into art galleries and such. But then they've created this wonderful walk that you sort of move from the ground up through the trees, up to above the canopy layer and back down. And you really get to experience the park sort of as this vertical moment, as well as on the plane.
Yes, I think that's very well put.
What drew you into an exploration of landscape architecture? I know that that's a departure for you as an architectural historian.
I think it was your previous book where.
Oh, yes. It was the book that I had just finished writing about the new cultural center in Athens, Greece. In Athens, Greece, designed by Renzo Piano and paid for to the tune of almost $1 billion by the Niarchos Foundation. I was asked, the foundation asked me to write a book about the cultural center. And so I devoted a chapter to each part of that center, theater, opera house, and so on. And there was also a very important park there that was created for the cultural center. And that is what sparked my interest in landscape design.
Very good, thank you. I think we have folks from the NYBG team. Are there any questions from the audience? Someone will be brave. Yes.
Was there anything that you had to leave out that was painful for you?
So the question is there anything that you had to leave out that was painful?
That's a tough question. I think what essentially happened is parks were, continuously opening, and at some point we had to sort of draw the line and stop and move into production on the book and writing and such. I feel like there were certainly parks in China. I think we had talked about a park in Egypt and such that were totally fascinating, but we just had to stop at some point. But yes.
Yes, there's a mic coming your way.
Hi, was there a particular park that was inspiring where they transformed a industrial site that was a mess and transformed it into something that the public could seek out and enjoy?
Yeah, I feel like all of the parks in the book are these post-industrial sites that are given back to the public. I think one park in particular, the Wetland Park. Whenever we would go to these parks, we'd also interview some of the park users and just, hear what brings them to the park and such like that. And we interviewed one gentleman who mentioned that he remembered the site when it was a former military shooting ground and then informal landfill, and the sort of visual scar of it on the landscape. And now he has moved, and it's something like a 2-hour commute for him, a public bus ride, but he comes to visit the park 3 times a week because he's so sort of overwhelmed by the transformation of the site and the sort of hope that it brings.
We have a question up front here. Yes, right up front. There we go.
Hi. Do you make a distinction in the book between publicly funded versus privately funded parks?
The distinction between public and private, yeah.
Public and private funding. In general, in the US, most of the parks, it's a mix of funding. Certainly in China, it was mostly government-funded projects. But it sort of varied a little bit, project to project. And Europe too, yeah.
And in the book, pardon me, Jennifer, in the book, do you note any differences that you observed with the distinction?
Part of this comes with the what Victoria was talking about, public process. So in the US, there is a sort of strong legacy of that, history of this. In countries like China and in some cases Europe, there is none of this, and the government builds, what they want. In some cases, yes, there were some instances where things had changed from what the designer had intended, for sure. And we did note that then when we saw that in the book, for sure.
Another question up front.
Yes, I'm very interested in the protection of parks. I speak because I've been a volunteer in Central Park for over 25 years. And if it wasn't for the Central Park Conservancy, we wouldn't have the Central Park as we know it. Now, the new governor has proposed allowing super talls to be built all over the city. And we know what the super talls, those are the very tall buildings, have done along Central Park South. And if they're allowed to go all over the city, they'll go up the west side, not on Central Park West because that's landmarked, but the block inside. And you put up those super talls and the park will suffer. The park is dark in the south. And I don't know where to turn. I, of course, can do nothing. But this is something that concerns me a lot. And I was just wondering what you might propose.
Oh, that's a good question. And yeah, that is concerning for sure.
There are a number of organizations, some of which you may already know, including New Yorkers for Parks, that I think are engaged in those issues. But it raises for me a related question about, you talked early in your remarks about the reaction in terms of increased prices and things like that to public spaces. Did you find a different level of civic engagement related to some of the parks that were initiated that you investigated?
A different level of civic engagement. How so?
Organizations that were created to foster more parks, or organizations that cropped up to maintain the spaces that had been created initially?
Yes. Okay. So in Dallas, for example, with Clyde Warren Park, there's been different foundations established to maintain that park and sort of operate the sort of public face, I would say, of the park. You bring up maintenance, which was a sort of interesting issue that we ran into quite often. And parks like Clyde Warren were very smart about incorporating commercial endeavors with the park and sort of saying that you can be here so long as a percentage of your profits go towards funding maintenance. And the result is they have a beautifully maintained public space.
So they factored in the ongoing maintenance of the park in the upfront design of how it would be administered.
Yes.
It's very interesting. Yes.
Thank you very much for that really, really wonderful and nuanced presentation. So I wanted to thank you first, and also to say that I found your global perspective on this multiplication of public parks. So I found the global perspective on the rise of global parks or botanical spaces quite interesting and fascinating, and the connection between them and the environmental degradation and the environmental movement that we've been noticing, we've been experiencing, also compelling. My question is, in choosing these parks across the world, as opposed to one particular area, did you have any specific selection criteria, or did anything specific drive you to choose the ones that you chose and to leave out some others?
Sure. Essentially, what was our criteria for choosing? We wanted sort of recent parks, so parks built within the last 20 years. And so that immediately ruled out, some very well-known parks built on post-industrial sites, Gasworks Park in Seattle, for example. And then we were looking at, all of these parks had some sort of ideas of reclamation, post-industrial conditions, material removal issues, these quarries and things like that. So these highly sort of contaminated sites, and all of these parks are sort of bringing this sort of, optimistic future to them and are actively engaged in cleaning the sites, removing these toxins and things like that. One of the interesting things I think from this experience was the importance of really visiting the parks and speaking with the design teams firsthand, because in some cases we would visit a park that no longer exists, that the site had been developed and the park ripped out. In other cases, the sort of beautiful glossy image that gets printed in design magazines is not the reality at all. So that was another way of sort of weeding out, I think, some of the parks, because I think in total we probably looked at 100 or so or more spaces, and these were the ones that we felt were sort of the most compelling.
We have a question in the back.
Hi. I was wondering if you could talk about grass. I've heard it compared to asphalt by environmentalists. And many of the parks that you discussed didn't have grass as a primary component, but a lot of them did. And I was just wondering if you could say anything about that.
Sure. So by grass, do you mean lawns as
Lawns.
opposed to meadows and such like this? Okay. Yeah. I think lawns are, there's a sort of vilification going on or a campaign against them. And, they do take a lot of maintenance to have the sort of beautiful English bowling green. It's a lot of chemical treatments and cutting. And what this does is it degrades the soil and the sort of microorganisms that live within that. So a lot of the parks we looked at, they had turned to different sustainable practices for maintenance, or had adopted sort of organic maintenance practices and such. In some cases, like the Hunters Point Park, that big sort of oval lawn, part of it is lawn and part of it is synthetic. And that's partially a response because that space is really meant to hold floodwaters, which would, of course, destroy the lawn. And also it's a game field, so kids running around it would destroy it immediately. So I definitely encourage, there's a sort of movement to sort of rewild your front lawn, bring it back to a meadow, things like that. I would say consider the lawn to be a space and not the sort of rubber stamping that I think is happening, and think about, I don't know what it kind of means in a way. What does a lawn have, versus meadows or a natural planting? I'm not sure I'm answering your question so well.
Not all lawns are.
Yeah,
created
they're
equal.
not all evil,
Asphalt,
but yeah.
Okay. Any other questions from the audience? One more over here, and then there we go.
Hi. I was just wondering, so all of the gardens are relatively new. Do you have any sense of the commitments of the founding entities to maintaining the gardens? Do you have any sense of the life cycles of these gardens? How long is the commitment? Will they be a Central Park 100 years from now, a Hyde Park or whatever? Can you talk about how you think they will be sustained and sustainable as they've been conceived over the period that you've been looking at them?
That's a good question about long-term commitments to the parks. I mentioned Clyde Warren Park in Dallas, and that foundation has a commitment to the maintenance of the park over the long term. And there, I think, were a few other parks that we looked at that had different foundations or friends of groups that really took over ownership of maintenance practices and funding and fundraising, I should say, for these parks. In terms of long term, that's a good question and something I need to think about a little bit more.
I think the community is extremely important in
Mm.
terms of the survival of a park. I mean, look at Central Park, how it had, deteriorated until one woman came along and revived it and, got uh, the people using it to donate their money to maintaining it. I mean, maintenance is as important for a park as designing it, creating it in the first place. I mean, you can do the most beautiful park in the world if it's not maintained, it won't survive.
One of the things that struck me in your remarks, Victoria, was the large numbers of people who are making use of these various spaces. I mean, you talked about hundreds of thousands, millions of people visiting these spaces each year. And I think that in and of itself is a source of some hope, because to the extent that these spaces become central to their communities, they have a better chance of persisting and thriving over time. Yeah. Okay, well, maybe I will ask one final question before we close this very stimulating lecture. In your new book, you mentioned a new wave of parks in response to three factors: the environmental movement, the post-industrial city, and the erosion of public spaces. As you look to the next 20 years, do you think that it is these three factors that will continue to drive the creation of parks, or are there new factors on the horizon?
I think in a lot of ways, these three factors are still extremely relevant. And so while as landscape architects, some of these are something that we've known about for a while. Ian McHarg's sort of seminal piece, Design with Nature from 1969, really brought a lot of attention within the profession to this. And there was a shift in the pedagogy towards total environmental design. And so I feel like right now, landscape architecture is sort of having a moment. There's a sort of very public interest in it. And I think that is just building momentum. And I think looking at issues as related to climate change and cities starting to wake up to this in a way. And we see this in Lower Manhattan with the sort of armament that's happening on the Lower East Side. So there's these issues are still extremely relevant. And I think that's really where landscape architecture is heading.
Wonderful. Well, landscape design has always been a very popular topic for enthusiasts of the New York Botanical Gardens. So we're glad that it's having a broader moment. And I want to thank you both for speaking with us this evening and for your riveting presentation, and congratulate you on the book, which I know everyone here is excited to read. I also want to thank again our trustee, Mark Porter, for hosting us here at Christie's tonight. It's always such a treat to be here. And thank you also to all of you, our patrons, supporters, trustees. It's wonderful to be with you this evening, and we hope that you'll join us in the Christie's atrium for cocktails. Thank you.